Hi friends, thank you for joining me today. My name is Diane and we are going to be learning about the anatomy of light and shadow as it falls on a three-dimensional object using charcoal. I hope you enjoy the class. Let's get started. So before we actually start drawing, I'm just going to walk you through some materials you're going to need for this experience. You'll need something round. I have a roll of tape. It doesn't matter what size it is, as long as it's not super teeny or bigger than your paper. It should be able to fit on the paper nicely with a little bit of space around it. May need a pencil sharpener. That's optional. If your pencil breaks, it's nice to have. For the same reason, there's these sandpaper pads that are sold in art stores for sharpening charcoal pencils. This is your charcoal pencil, it's nice to have this. It's really nice to have it. I strongly recommend it, but it's not absolutely necessary. You can get away without it. But if you need to sharpen it, you just kind of rub it on the scratch paper, sandpaper. Whoops, and I broke my lead. That does happen. We'll get to resharpening that later when I need it. Then you need an eraser. This is an eraser specifically made for charcoal. It's called a kneaded eraser. And it's called that because you knead it like bread dough in order to get a clean edge. So the whiter it is, the cleaner it is. And when you want to erase, you just stretch off to get a clean part and then you erase your charcoal. You can also use any eraser to erase charcoal. This is fine. This one just takes off large amounts, large areas without taking off a ton of charcoal. It's a little more delicate to work with, so that's nice. Then we have this tool, which is one of my favorite all-time things. It's actually an eraser, but it's in the shape of a pencil. So you can erase very delicate, teeny little edges and sharp things, details. This is also not 100% necessary, but I strongly recommend having it. You will probably need this. This is a blending stump. It's just a really tightly rolled piece of paper with a point on either end, and you use it to soften and blend charcoal. You can also use it for pastel or other blendable media. But you use it when your finger is just a little bit too large and wide to get sharp, fine areas to blend. And then as for the charcoal itself, you'll need two kinds. This one is thick and chunky. It's called compressed charcoal. It's very dark. And then we also have this one. It's a lighter, it's called willow charcoal or vine charcoal. It breaks really easily. In fact, sometimes you want to break it on purpose because it's a little easier to work with smaller pieces. And it goes on very light. It's very easily erasable. So we're going to do all of our values in vine charcoal first because it's sort of a good charcoal to put your road map down with for your object, and then we'll follow up with the compressed charcoal and the detail stuff. Got some charcoal in my paper, so I blow it off. So first thing you're going to do is take your round object and your pencil. Oh, I forgot to mention you need a pencil so you can draw your round object. And all you're going to do is put your round object off center on your paper a little bit, leaving a little space on one side or the other. Let's just leave it on the left so we're all doing the same thing, and trace it so that you have a very round, pretty perfectly round object. And we're just going to color in the sphere and make it look like a three-dimensional sphere instead of a two-dimensional circle. So one thing I want to mention is I use the word value to describe the lights and darks of how the charcoal goes in. That's a word you'll hear a lot. It is just a term we use in art to describe how light or dark something is. And in charcoal or any black and white medium, graphite or ink or anything like that, black and white paint, it's very useful because we are not dealing with color. So you can't say a color is darker than the other or whatnot. You say a value. So we're going to start by putting in a layer of charcoal on the sphere itself. And what we're going to do is imagine that there is the light source, the sun or a lamp or whatever, is coming from the right side and hitting our object right about here. And that's going to be where our brightest highlight is. And I'm going to talk you through the different parts of shadows and highlights as well, and what their names are and kind of how they represent themselves on a two-dimensional page. So for right now, just draw a very light circle around your imagined highlight, and then you can color in the rest of your sphere. So when you get up to the edge, you want to go very careful, very, very carefully, so that you really maintain the integrity of that pretty perfect circle. Don't worry if you accidentally get outside a little bit or make it a little lumpy. We can always refine it later, but for right now, we're just trying our best to go slowly and carefully and kind of go around the outside edge to reinforce that circle. Then you can go pretty loose when you're coloring in the inside. I like to kind of make my strokes mirror the direction of the circle. So rather than coloring it all one way or the other way, just from the very beginning, kind of color in circular strokes, because every stroke you make is going to kind of be a informer for the next stroke. So the earlier on that you are mimicking the direction of your object, the better off you will be, and the more easily and fluidly this will come together. So I've colored the whole thing. You can either blow off the dust, or if you have a trash can nearby, you can pick up your paper and shake it into the trash can, which I'm going to do, or both. Shake it, then blow it. The shaking is just if you don't want to get dust everywhere. And then use one finger and go around and rub it in. This is called blending, and we're just trying to get the color, the value fairly even. And as you can see, especially with vine charcoal, when you blend, it gets on your finger and color comes off, the value comes off the paper. So it's going to be a bit lighter than it was when you originally put it down, and that's just the natural way of this material. So I blended it all in. Around the edges, I'm trying to use the side of my finger so that I keep the edge as sharp as possible. And then I forgot to mention, you can have a towel nearby or something to wipe excess charcoal off on. And then I'm going to go into the highlight and blend. I'm pressing pretty hard. I'm blending the edges of my shape into the highlight. So that creates the bright spot. And don't worry if you overblend or if it becomes too dark. Like I feel like I already overblended mine. We'll pull some color off later. Main thing is you just want a color, a value on your paper. I keep saying color. To kind of establish the shape of the sphere. We're going to do a similar thing with what's called the cast shadow. The cast shadow is the shadow going off to the side here. The light that's hitting the object is blocked by the object, and it creates a shadow on the opposite side of the highlight. So we're just going to kind of make it up, just draw sort of an oval shape that's going to disappear into a fine line right where the circle, the sphere touches the ground. And then otherwise, it doesn't even matter how long it goes. You just want it to be pretty pointy with the exception of the very round tip here, but long and thin, because it's a very big abstraction of this shape. So it's not going to be anywhere near circular. And then you can color this in as well, just as a first step. And I'm purposely coloring this a little bit more thoroughly. And notice I'm coloring side to side because the shadow goes off to the side. So I'm following the direction of the shadow. I'm purposely coloring it darker because that shadow is going to be a little bit darker than the very left side of the sphere. And I want to try to maintain my edge if I can. I'm going to shake off the dust into the garbage and blow it off. And you can see it goes everywhere. That's okay. You can, don't worry about anything around here. We can always touch it up and clean it up later. And the earlier you start obsessing about like, oh, I've got to get rid of that, then the more times you have to do it. So it's best to just leave it to the end. So now I will blend my cast shadow, again, trying to keep my edge against the sphere pretty sharp. But then as I blend out, I can get a little looser with it. And the further away the shadow gets from the object, the blurrier it will be. So when I'm out here, I'm going to purposely go outside and smear it a bunch so that it's very blurry. But as I get closer, I'm going to go more side to side. And then as I get closer here, I'm going to go more side to side so that it's not quite as blurry. I'm going to re-emphasize that by just going way out there and really smearing it around so that it disappears pretty gradually on the left side. I'm going to wipe my finger. And now I'm going to go back in with with the compressed charcoal, and we're going to put in the darkest shadows, and then we're going to kind of marry the dark shadows with the light by lots of blending and adding more vine charcoal and some erasing. So this next shadow I'm putting in is called the core shadow. It's the darkest shadow on any object, And it's almost never right next to the highlight unless there was like a sharp edge there, but on a sphere there's no sharp edges. So it's going to be a ways away on the left side, the far left side, but it is not going to go all the way to the edge. I'm going to leave a space showing there. So I am going to go all the way to the edge on the top left side of the sphere, but then as I come down, I'm pulling away from the edge so that I leave a sliver of reflection here, because the light is naturally going to bounce off the mat and bounce back onto the sphere, creating a reflection right there. And that also creates a lovely sort of separation between the sphere itself and the cast shadow. So you can think of this as like a crescent moon shape because it's the shape of the sphere. So sphere is a moon. But the core shadow does not encompass the entire thing. It just takes up the darkest part. So I've established my sort of curve there, and now I'm going to come way into the sphere and make it much thicker. So I would say it goes about a third of the way in on this particular object. They're going to vary no matter what. And obviously I'm just making this up. I'm not looking at a real object. But the more you kind of get used to the seeing core shadows and highlights and things on different objects, the more your brain will naturally be able to sort of just put them where they belong. But if the light was at a steeper angle, say the highlight was right here, then the core shadow would come out a little bit further to sort of balance the highlight. So now I'm just coloring pretty thoroughly there. I'm going to shake off the dust into the garbage, blow it off. And now I'm going to blend the core shadow. First, I'm just going to blend the shadow itself, just putting my finger inside of it and get that edge really sharp by keeping the very edge of my finger against the edge of the sphere. And then moving down and blending, just getting all those little white specks out that are left from the paper showing through. And I'm going to do the same thing on this edge where I'm just blending very, very slowly and carefully against that edge because I want to maintain the circle shape. And now I'm going to use what's on my finger and blend in kind of small circles out to the right to get the core shadow to soften into the rest of the shape. Or the other word for this the sort of main value on the sphere is called local color on a colored object. I'm not sure if it's called local color on a black and white object actually, because as I mentioned, there's no color. Maybe it's local value or something, but the point is it's the term for the main value or color on your object. So I'm just really softening this into it because I don't want there to be any evidence of the line between the two that was there before. So I'm even creeping up on the right side a little bit here, darkening that, and then it gets lighter as it goes towards the highlight. Really pulling this in. You can always add more charcoal if you need to, but I like to try to rely on the blending first because it tends to be a more gradual, organic sort of feel between extreme dark and extreme light. Here I'm going to use, there's a lot of charcoal on my finger, I'm going to use the edge of my finger and just sort of pull that around and connect to the other side of what I was doing here. Trying to stay away from the highlight, but remember we can always pull color off with the eraser if we need to. But I am darkening this edge because that's going to make it look round, like it's going around the back side of the sphere. Now, as for this side, I'm going to just wipe my finger off because I feel like I have a little too much charcoal. I'm going to do a similar thing that I did here, except here I did much bigger circles. Here, I'm just going to kind of blend along the edge at first to see what it does, because what I'm going for is a gradual change from core shadow to reflected light, but there's a much smaller space there, so I don't want to do big circles because I'll just cover up that whole reflected light. And that is looking pretty good. Just want a little sliver of slightly lighter color than the core shadow, but it'll usually be the same value or a little bit darker than your local color because it is, after all, in the shadowy part of the picture. Okay, now that we've got that, I'm going to take my compressed charcoal again, find a sharp, sharp corner, and just color a thin little line right where the sphere touches the ground. A common mistake here is to make it kind of hug the sphere and make like a smile shape. Don't fall into that trap. All we want is the very darkest place where the sphere is touching the ground to be really, really dark. That is called the occlusion shadow. It's where light doesn't exist, kind of like in the core shadow. Um, but it does disappear gradually into the cast shadow. And the cast shadow needs to be darkened a little bit more right next to the object too, because now that I've darkened the core shadow, this just doesn't appear dark enough. So I'm going to encourage the occlusion shadow into the cast shadow by kind of having it open up into like a fan shape here. But I'm coloring very lightly. Unlike when I was under here, I pressed very hard because I wanted it absolute black. Now I'm just coloring very lightly because I want it to gradually turn into the cast shadow. Let me get rid of the dust here, blow off the rest. And I'm going to add a little bit more because, as I mentioned, I want the cast shadow to be a little bit darker right next to the ball, which is where it would be darkest, except for the occlusion shadow, which is obviously the darkest. Now I'm going to blend and really encourage that blend into the rest of the cast shadow. And then as I get right up next to the sphere, just use the very edge of my finger to blend. And this is where, right about now, where your blending stump can come in really handy. So just find the fine point of it, and you can replace your finger as a blending tool with the blending stump. Get right up next to the edge and even refine the shape. I got a little bit of a rounded point there. Then I want to smooth that out and get rid of it. And then I'm going to blend into the occlusion shadow. Stop right there. I went a little far. I'm wiping off my blending stump because I have too much charcoal. Blow off the dust. And then I want the very bottom edge to be soft. So I'm just going to go back and soften it by rubbing back and forth, side to side. I don't want to spread it. I just want to soften. And I'm still wanting to refine this shape a little bit more. That edge. And then I'm going to just go back and touch up. So here I have my occlusion shadow ending fairly abruptly. Don't really want that, so I'm going to use my eraser pencil, or you could use your charcoal your charcoal eraser, your kneaded eraser, or your other eraser, cap eraser, pink pearl eraser, what have you. Blow off the dust there. Sometimes eraser crumbs stick to the paper a little bit more than you'd wish, so you can either use your finger to rub them off, or you can actually use the eraser itself and just barely touch the crumbs to loosen them, and then they tend to be a little more agreeable to going away. I also need, for my core shadow, to go all the way to the base of my sphere here. It eloped a little bit and sort of didn't quite make it, so I'm going to just fill that in. The touch-up part is one of my favorite parts of a picture. I don't know why, it just is. And actually, I feel like I need to make that a little bit rounder too. Got a little flat there. Then I'm going to use my eraser pencil to refine the shape from the outside. Being right-handed, this is convenient because I can just point right at the object, and I'm going to just continue going around and refining the shape this way, kind of getting rid of any little stubborn dots or specks, smudges that went outside the edge of the sphere. If you're left-handed, you can turn it upside down and do it, or as you go around, you have to turn it upside down anyway if you're right-handed, because you're going around the entire sphere to do this. You could also fill in the background if you want with a light shade of vine charcoal, if that appeals to you, or you don't have to. Get rid of the eraser crumbs. There we go. And we can certainly use probably the kneaded eraser just to get rid of all of this charcoal dust, the evidence of the dust having sprayed everywhere. If you feel you need to lighten your highlight, which I do, I would go back with the kneaded eraser and erase out a big circle and then go back and reblend. And there, we're pretty much done with our exercise. So I'll just review the types of lights and shadows. The brightest one is the highlight. The color, the main value or color around it, that's called the local color. The darkest shadow on an object is the core shadow. The reflection on the side opposite the highlight is called reflected light. The shadow that the object is casting onto the ground or the table or whatever is the cast shadow. And then the very darkest, teeny little shadow that only exists where the object actually physically touches the surface is called the occlusion shadow. And that is it, my friends. Thank you for joining me.